Um, Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending. I think people are still filtering into the webinar, but thank you for attending the Climate Community Practice, Climate and Resilience Grant Writing 101. We're going to go ahead and get started here. I appreciate y'all joining us for this rather long webinar, but we really hope you get something out of it. Tracy, would you go to the next slide? I just want to go over a couple of quick things before we get started. You can see where the yellow arrow is. You've been muted. We're going to remain muted. And then the red arrow is for the chat box. This is how we're going to be gathering your questions. We're going to put some important links there as well. So just keep an eye on that chat box. We've got somebody monitoring the chat box for the Q&A. I'll post the agenda in just a second. We have 2 Q&A slots. So please either drop your questions for the speakers into that chat box or hold them until our Q&A slots. And just to let you know as well, the webinar is being recorded. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Rhonda Price, who is our first speaker with Mississippi DMR. Thank you, Rhonda.
Hey, good morning, everyone. So I'm first up, Rhonda Price with the Department of Marine Resources in Mississippi. I'm the Office Director for the Office of Coastal Restoration and Resilience. And if any of you are familiar with the Gulf of Mexico Alliance, I lead the Coastal Resilience team. So this morning, I'm going to talk a little bit about, so you want to get a grant and what that means and some of the steps that go into the life cycle of those grants. Am I supposed to advance? But thank you. So we're talking about the life cycle of grants. So you may hear about a pre-award phase, an award phase, and a post-award phase. So those are kind of the topics that we're going to discuss this morning. Getting a grant, these are going to be the 3 that you deal with most, and they're going to be somewhat high level. We're not going to get down into the weeds. And so the next slide, grant writing proposals. Grant writing proposals is an excellent skill, and if you're a good and even envied skill, truth is anyone can learn how to write grant proposals and through trial and error even become a successful one. But you have to keep your attention on learning, doing your research, writing grant applications, and most of all, power of communication. Communication will be key in a successful grant writing endeavor. So next slide. We're going to talk about some things that you may want to focus on in your grant writing. When I started writing grants, I was told to start with an idea, follow through with that idea, but where there would be times, and all times, there would be rules to follow. And a grant life cycle is basically that main phase, 3 main phases, that pre-award process, the award, and then the post-award process. Next slide. So let's talk about the pre-award phases. Once you found an opportunity, read the entire announcement. It's one of the things I often see that applicants overlook. Many want to dive directly into the middle of the grant and start writing the narrative. Then the day before the grant is due, they realize they need letters of support, you haven't met the page limit, you need a match, or you haven't registered with a systems award management. And some of you may have heard of sam.gov. Every organization that gets a grant with federal government is required to register with SAM. So read the announcement. Sometimes vital information is buried in the fine print. Reading the funding Opportunity announcements or the request for proposals will also give you clues like their priorities, their scoring criteria. Knowing these little clues will help craft a stronger application. Most FOAs will require the proposal be submitted um, through grants.gov, and grants.gov will also walk you through the registration process under the Applicants tab. SAM has the System Award Management has a frequently asked question on their homepage. Grant money may come from federal agencies like Fish and Wildlife, the Park Service, NOAA, or state agencies like the DMR or DEQ. Sometimes these grants are funded through federal dollars and are called pass-through grants. Corporate, community, and private foundations are also available, like Walton and State Farm, just as examples. So now you're ready to start writing. When crafting your needs statement, include statistics and data where you can. Most writers get caught up in the romance of the project and write a paragraph of emotion. While that's great, and I'm not saying leave that out, but include sources and data about why your project is needed. It's much easier for evaluators scoring the project. Share those real stories and testimonials, but also include some numbers or citations. Forming a grant writing team also helps craft a strong proposal. They can be in-house staff like directors, finance, and HR, or even outside partners that are subject matter experts that can write or provide the data and technical or project specifics. Use SMART objectives, and that's specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time. They will provide you with a template for a clear description for your project. Instead of writing, our objective is to provide training, use those SMART objectives provides measurable and understandable objectives. Specific. This is a specific number of trainings, the number of people or organizations, what type of training, the location, the duration, like 1 year. Measurable. This objective measures due to the number of trainings, the people trained, and with a specific time frame. You can track, if you reach your goal, the number of people and trainings. Achievable. Are you able to reach this objective? This goes back to the need. Our funding found using the CRI that 100 communities lacked adequate training or evacuation procedures. And do you have enough in the budget? R for relevant, and that is my project relevant to what I'm trying to achieve? Would you help reduce the needs stated in your needs section? Time bound, do you have an end date? And then last is your budget, project budget. So numbers are scary. So many times the budget is the last thing drafted, but in reality, it should be the first thing you do before writing the entire narrative. After you know there is a need for your project, draft the goals and objectives. Then figure out how much money it will realistically take. Completing the budget first allows you to know how much money you will need to provide 100 trainings. Trying to rewrite a project narrative at the very end is no fun and can ruin your chances on submitting on time. No one wants to waste time. This is why having a finance or budget specialist on your team may help ease the burden of working with the numbers. It also helps to review 2 CFR 200. This helps sometimes when you're not specifically stated in the FOA or RFP in determining what is and what isn't allowable cost. And lastly, it's good to have a checklist. When preparing your proposal for submission, some funding opportunities will have applications and forms to fill out, along with their project narrative, budget narrative. If applying for federal funds, you will need to fill out a standard Form 424, a standard application that includes a budget and assurances or certifications. Checklists help you not to forget. Next slide, we move on to the award. So now what? Now that you have this award, what what can you expect? So next slide. So you've been given this award, so now the work begins. A notice of award is official legal binding agreement some agency may use as a subgrant, cooperative agreement, or subaward. When you receive the agreement, review the document, paying particular attention to any terms and conditions that may come with the funds. This may include certain federal and state statutory or regulatory requirements, like the Code of Federal Regulations, when I mentioned the 2 CFR 200, or other program rules or policies. Once your organization accepts the grant, either by signing the agreement or drawing down the funds, you become legally obligated to carry out the terms and conditions of the grant. Your agreement may also include reporting and reimbursement details, programmatically and financially. If it's federal funding, you may fill out an SF 269. If you have subawardees, there may be monitoring that should be set up, which sometimes make reporting easier. It's also important to draw down funds in a timely manner. If not, it not only helps you, it allows the funding agency to see progress is being made, and easier if you need an extension at the end. Concise reporting is also key to a successful project, whether quarterly or monthly. It allows the project manager, both awarding and you, to see the project hit their measurable objectives, and if it's not, why and how to correct it early. If you don't make it to this part of being an awardee, ask for feedback when your proposal is rejected, and don't get discouraged. When one of your grants is rejected, reach out, ask for feedback. Not some organizations, however, will not provide feedback, but some will provide valuable insight. Take that constructive criticism. It never hurts, and it only helps you fine tune your idea along with your writing skills to become a better grant writer. Take that knowledge and try again, and sometimes again, for your next time. And next, we're moving into, you've done all this work, and now you're moving into that post-award where your deliverables and reporting and closeout happens. So after you've come to the end of your grant, one of these things will happen. The recipient may ask to extend the project for up to 12 months. If funds remain and the project is not yet complete, the agency may agree to a no-cost extension. That's when the funds are expended, but the work is incomplete. And the third is both parties may close out the grant. So in the next slide, we're going to focus on the closeout. Submitting a comprehensive final report summarizing your achievements and challenges and financial status. Closing out a grant occurs when the awarding agency determines that all administrative actions and required programmatic work under the grant has been completed. Some programs may have a template to follow, which you should have received and used if you had quarterly or monthly reporting to do during the grant period. If federal per CFR 200, 343, financial, performance, and other reports must be submitted 90 days after the grant expires. In addition, you may be required to submit a disposition of property report. There is no standard property report, disposition report. Some agencies have designed their own with requirements on how to handle equipment, real property, supplies, once the grant is closed. You should receive those instructions once you're into that closeout phase. And then settlement of accounts. To close out a grant, you must settle all accounts with subrecipients and subcontractors before closing out the grant. Once the grant is closed and invoice is received, anything after that may be your responsibility. So it's important to get all of your invoices submitted during that 90-day closeout. Normally, a final audit is unnecessary unless there's a problem with the grant that requires audit attention. Audits are not required for closeout, but even if a final audit is not performed prior to closeout, the awarding agency retains the right. When you receive your closeout letter, you may be asked to retain your files for a period of 3 years. The audits are never fun, and you may never receive one on a small time, one time grant. But in a few cases, it's better to be prepared. So keeping your records organized and maintained will help if that time ever comes. A non-federal entity that expends 750,000 or more in federal funds during its fiscal year may be required to have a single audit for that year. So during closeout, that is when you submit your deliverables. That may be a plan, a data set, website, or a detailed overview of trainings you conducted. There also may be times where deliverables may be submitted during the award period based on milestones or measurables in your proposal. Closeout is a great time to take a moment to reflect. What went right? What went wrong? What didn't we do? And what did we identify any gaps? Or did we identify any gaps that follow up where a future grant could be written? Evaluate your success by collecting feedback from partners and stakeholders. When you started this project, you probably held a kickoff meeting, so it never hurts to close out a project with a meeting or a call. Lastly, you receive a closeout letter from the awarding agency. The letter may contain information if there were funds remaining, how long to retain your records, and the disposition of property instructions. So our last slide is just kind of a recap of final tips and takeaways. Preparing a strong proposal, so being clear and concise, writing with a detailed plan. Create that, develop that realistic budget first, include all necessary expenses. If match is required, identify the source and demonstrate your ability to secure the funds and partners. The best way sometimes to do that is through letters of support through those partners and funds. And remember, building relationships is the communication is power. And then staying organized and maintaining those organized records. Submit your reports timely along with your pay requests. Some resources that may be helpful in grant writing or learning more about grants. Grants.gov, SAM.gov, and then some for nonprofits, the candid.org and Foundation Directory Online. These are nonprofits with information, resources, training, and data to find funding opportunities. They sometimes charge for data, but during the course, they offer small nonprofits free access through promotions and special programs. Foundation Directory is also a searchable database about foundations and grants that are supported. Also, if you are a university, your university may subscribe to SPIN, that is a Sponsored Programs Information Network. That database will house information on government and private funding sources. And last but not least is take some more training, in-depth courses like management concepts. They offer a lot of virtual and in-house training on grants. And that pretty much sums up if you're wanting to get a grant. And that is the last slide outside of my contact information. I think we're going to take questions later on. So
yeah,
Jody,
we're gonna take questions in a little while, but feel free to drop your questions into that chat box. If you don't want to, try to remember it for another 30 minutes or so. Thank you, Rhonda. That was great. We are going to turn it over next to Kiama Williams, who's with Place SLR with Mississippi State and I believe Mississippi Alabama Sea Grant. And she's going to talk to us more about elements of a common grant proposal. Kiama?
Thank you, Jody. So grants can look a little different in structure and application requirements depending on who's providing it, who that granting agency is and where that grant is coming from, which it is why it's important to read through those applications and the documents that are provided. But that being said, there are a lot of common elements that we usually expect to see, and those are what I'll be talking about today. Next slide, please. So we're going to start with some common acronyms and terminology. Rhonda did a great job of already bringing some of those up. It is by no means an exhaustive list. Typically, grants will also provide their own list of terminology for terms and words that they feel are relevant to that grant opportunity. Then we'll go into the need of a grant proposal and addressing that need through the different elements of a project narrative, a budget, and evaluation. And then finally, we'll end with discussing things like your project team and letters of support. Next slide. Okay, so let's start with the acronyms. These are the ones that often get tossed around when a new grant opportunity is announced. Rhonda brought some up earlier. These are some more, starting with the RFP, RFA, NOFO. Those are, different terms and acronyms that are pretty related. So we have the request for proposals or applications and the notice of funding opportunity. So these are all different ways that you might hear someone refer to a grant opportunity. Related to that is the LOI, or letter of intent. Sometimes it's also referred to as the letter of interest. Sometimes grants, especially larger ones, will ask for interested parties to submit an LOI first, which is basically a shorter summary than what you would normally include in a grant proposal. Sometimes it's 2 pages, sometimes it's a little bit more, but basically you would submit this as a shorter summary of what you plan to do with the funding. And then the granting agency would invite those groups to then submit a full, larger proposal. LOS or LOC, letters of support or commitment. These are additional supporting documents that you would gather from project partners or project supporters. We'll go into some more detail about those a little later. And then the PI, that's another one that gets tossed around a lot. Basically, the PI, principal investigator or primary investigator, is the lead person or organization for that grant opportunity. Next slide, please. Here are a few more terms. Period of performance is one you'll hear. Simply put, this is basically the time frame you're given to complete your proposed grant activities, usually once funds have been awarded. As Rhonda mentioned, sometimes their work isn't done within that period of performance, and you may have to ask to extend that period. So typically that can be 6 months or up to a year to the funding agency requesting to extend that project period. And then match is a term related to budgeting. Rhonda also brought that one up. Some grants might require you to have funding sources that are independent from the grant opportunity that you're applying for, but they would also be used towards that project. And this is a very simplified description. There's a lot more that can go into it, which is why, again, it's important to read through the grant details and documents. And the subaward is another common term where you'll hear from your primary investigator, your PI, your lead on the grant. Subaward is the funding that gets passed through that main grant recipient to other partners. So it's separate from a contract. Next slide, please. All right, so now each grant has objectives or goals that are specific for their funding. There's different outcomes that they want to see related to that funding. So whatever your project idea is, or however great it might be, you need to make sure that you can tie it into those grant objectives. Additionally, some grants may have different levels of funding available within the same opportunity. So for example, I've seen them referred to as tracks or even just different objectives, but you may have a track 1 that's targeted towards groups doing work towards one type of objective, while track 2 maybe for groups working on a different objective, or a track 1 that is for organizations, who are aiming to do more capacity building versus organizations who are taking proposed actions and activities. And then so getting into your actual grant writing, making sure that your proposed work fits into the objectives that you're applying for. Next slide, please. So this is what I consider the fun part of writing the grant, the project narrative. This is where you're really getting to the problems that you're trying to address, right? So when you're writing this, usually you'll have a summary of everything that you're trying to do, but project narrative is where you break down into what is the problem that you're identifying. This is where you pull in data to complement the emotion, as Rhonda said earlier, to really demonstrate the need of this funding for your project. You also are providing justification for why you're doing what you're doing in the area that you've chosen, whether that's a local or a regional collaboration. Your proposed solution, how are you going to solve the problem that you've identified, and tying back into how that relates to the objectives of the grant. Often grants want to see you leverage previous work or ongoing work related to what you're proposing. They want to see that, you know, you have thought about this or you have done some work towards it previous to the grant, and also plans to continue on in the future outside of the grant lifecycle. Also outlining what are the expected outcomes and outputs. What are you producing as a result of this funding opportunity? And then who will benefit from the project completion? Are there specific groups that are being targeted? Next slide, please. I'm going to briefly go into budgets. I know someone else will go into a little more detail, but budgets are where you are explaining how exactly you're going to use those funds. So typically, granting organizations will provide you a template and a narrative. So the narrative is where you write out, similar to your project narrative in words, how exactly you are going to spend the money, what you're going to use it for. And then the templates can typically be, you know, something like an Excel spreadsheet where you're calculating what the different funding groups are going to be. Basically, what you're really doing with your budget is telling the granting agency exactly how you're planning to spend the money with detailed descriptions and as accurate amounts for those proposed activities as you can get. Part of that is the justification for why things cost a certain amount or why you're distributing funds a certain way. That's, you know, within your own organization, but also with subawards and to partner organizations, making sure that you're justifying and you can show the granting agency that the amounts you're requesting for are accurate. And then something that comes up a lot is direct versus indirect. Those are the two major groups that your funding will often get split into. So your direct costs are typically your expenses for activities under the grant. So that can be like your salary, the amount of time you're spending while you're doing the proposed activities within this grant. Also money for materials, activities, related travel. And indirect is usually calculated by a percentage that is set to cover things like your organizational or administrative costs, not specifically defined by this grant. And then some supplemental material that you might often see or you might include yourself are things like timelines, or what are referred to as Gantt charts. And so basically, this is a timeline where for each grant objective that you're planning to do, you are mapping out across the grant period, whether that's several years or several months, you know, when you are planning to do those, and showing that those activities do fit within the proposed timeline. Next slide, please. And another important part of the grant proposal is the evaluation. So mainly, what are your measures of success? What are the objectives that you are planning to hit that shows that you were successful in doing your proposed activity for this grant? And another thing they want to know is how you are tracking these measures. So it's one thing to know what they are. It's another thing to tell them how exactly you are going to evaluate yourself on whether you are successful or not, whether that's surveys, whether that's hiring an outside evaluator. There are a couple different options. Another important part of this is data collection and management. So Rhonda also mentioned things about reporting after the life cycle of the grant. And so making sure that you are collecting relevant data. What is the plan for holding on to that data for a good amount of time? And then reporting your process and results. So when you do get to the end of your activity, when you've completed, you found yourself to be successful and the activities that you propose to do, then how are you reporting those results out? Are you reporting just to the granting agency, or are you reporting to the greater community you've been working with? What is the plan to host important documents or public facing documents, things of that nature? And another thing that is supplemental to that gets added are logic models. This is another type of way to measure if you are achieving those objectives or those measures of success you've laid out for yourself. Next slide, please. All right, so your project team. So who is taking the lead and who are going to be the partners or the sub-awards? Are there contracts you need to put out? So this is also important to look at when you're looking at those notices of funding or those grant opportunities. Certain grants are looking for specific types of organizations to be on the lead of them. You want to make sure all of the organizations are eligible for the grant. So making sure that if you're a nonprofit or everyone involved has the proper documentation or the federal registration to be able to participate. Deciding what roles they're going to play. This is an important one. So justifying to the grantor why you have the partners you do, what value do they bring? So what is the experience that they will bring to this project that you're attempting to fund? Typically, grants also like to have you submit usually 2-page CVs or resumes for each of those partners to show that justification and background of why they are experienced enough to be participating or have the necessary qualifications. And then, as I mentioned a little bit before, the special requirements. So definitely with things like Justice 40 money that's come out and making sure that, grant funds have been equitable. There have been some special requirements about who can be the lead, who can participate, and what kind of partners you might bring. So for an example, you might have a grant that asks for at least, 2 or 3 of the partners being community-based organizations. Or you might see a grant that is asking for, regardless of who is the lead, to have one partner or have support from a municipal organization related to the grant. So once again, it's important to read through and make sure that you are meeting all of those eligibility requirements and those special requirements for being able to apply for the grant. Next slide, please. And then letters of support. So we talked about this a little bit earlier, but these are typically 1-page formal letters. They're submitted by your project partners or supporters, maybe potential future project partners that are not fully committed. Basically, they outline the partner's background. Typically, grant agencies like to see these written by the partners themselves as opposed to a form letter, but they are basically outlining their roles and responsibilities under the grant and stating support for what the goals, activities, and outcomes that you are trying to achieve in this. So these are a supplemental and important piece of any grant application. So that was a brief summary of the different parts of a grant that you typically tend to see. And just one last reminder, it is always important to read through and make sure that you're hitting all of the parts that specific grant request is asking for. And with that, I will pass it back to Jody.
Thank you, Kiama. That was great. Just as a reminder, feel free to drop questions in the chat for Kiama or Rhonda or any of our speakers. And now that Rhonda and Kiama have given us a very nice overview of what goes into a grant proposal and what the life cycle of a grant is, we're going to turn a little bit and hear from the perspective of couple of funders what they would like to hear to make an effective grant for them. First, we have Ross Weaver with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and he's going to talk about telling your story from the perspective of the National Coastal Resilience Fund. Ross, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Jody. And thank you all for attending today. It's nice to meet you guys virtually. Like Jody said, my name is Ross Weaver. I'm the program manager for coastal resilience at NIFWF. Still fairly new to that role. For the previous 8 years, I was working at a much smaller nonprofit in the Mid-Atlantic doing coastal resilience planning. So sort of have perspectives of applying to grants, and then I've kind of switched sides now and started to administer them. So to kick things off, I'm just going to give kind of a brief overview of the grant I manage, the National Coastal Resilience Fund, just make sure everyone's aware of it. And then for the majority of my time, I'll kind of talk about what we're looking for, how you can sort of tailor your proposals to make them most successful, how you can kind of tips and strategies just to make sure that that your proposals are as strong as they can be. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. Okay, so if you're not familiar with the NCRF, the purpose is really pretty simply just to advance the use of nature-based solutions to address coastal risks. In terms of our scope, this is a national grant, so both coasts, but then also Hawaii, Alaska, Guam, really all over the place. We typically have about $145 million a year in terms of our funding ability. It is a very competitive grant. We get, just as an example, we're currently in our 2024 cycle. So this year we received 384 pre-proposals, and the requested amount was a little over 750 million. So it's definitely important to think about how you can sort of separate yourself from the pack when you're applying to grants like this. We don't have any kind of caps on the awards we give, but typically for planning and design grants, they go up to about $1 million. And then for the implementation grants, those are always a little bit more expensive. Those can go up to about 10 million. I'll have a larger conversation about match. We don't require it, although it is strongly encouraged. And I'll talk about some of the ways that you can kind of show that match, whether it's in kind or cash. But like I say, we can get into that in a little bit. Next slide, please. So just to spend a second kind of talking about what the NCRF is looking for, we're really looking for projects that propose solutions that restore habitat, mimic natural processes. There are really two goals we have in mind. So one is to build the resilience of communities to coastal hazards and changing environmental conditions. And that second goal is to enhance habitat for fish and wildlife. So this is an important thing to consider, because the proposals we're looking for really need to speak to both of those elements. And what are the specific nature-based solutions that will be advanced through your project, and then how those solutions kind of help enhance community resilience, improve fish and wildlife habitat as well. Oftentimes we'll have projects that are really strong on the kind of ecological side and have a reduced impact for community benefits, or vice versa. So we'll get into this with the tips and tricks, but kind of a good example of how you really need to be thinking about what are the goals of the funder. In this case, we really do need to have both of these, these dual benefits being met. Next slide, please. So this one I meant to take off. I think if you can click it a few times, a few different things will come up. Maybe, when am I clicking it? Maybe 4 more times. Sorry about that. Okay, I think that's basically got it. So just in terms of the nature-based solutions that we're looking for, these are things like coastal wetlands, oysters, seagrasses, subaquatic vegetation. We see a lot of living shorelines, coastal forests, beaches, sand dunes. I also do quite a lot of work with coral. And so these are examples of kind of those nature-based features that protect and promote fish and wildlife habitat. Obviously, coastal wetlands and oysters and corals are incredibly valuable biomes, but then also have this benefit of reducing wave energy, acting as sponges in urban areas for flooding, reducing erosion, things like that. So this is kind of the majority of the projects we fund, but I'll get into on the next slide sort of. We also have a real focus on planning and what we call our pipeline of projects. So I'll explain that on the next slide. I'm sorry, I know I might have to click through it one more time. Okay, that's got it, thanks. So this is kind of interesting. The NCRF was founded in 2018. And at first we were really focused primarily on kind of shovel-ready restoration projects. I think like a lot of funders, you want to see as much impact as possible. You want to be able to explain, where your money is going making sure you have the biggest impact possible on our end. But it's funny, when this first came out, I actually came and talked to NIFWIF when I was working at my previous job, because there weren't a lot of projects coming in. I was based in Virginia, and there weren't a lot of projects coming in from Virginia, talking about kind of why that was. And it's really because most localities, nonprofits, don't really have shovel-ready projects just sitting on a shelf. It's quite expensive to do that initial planning, to do the site assessment, the final design, all the permitting costs. Typically, in my experience, when localities especially had done that work, they already had a funding source identified for restoration and implementation. So we, well, at that time, NIFWIF, before I joined, started to kind of think about how the organization could support localities and organizations wherever they were in these projects. And so we developed this sort of resilient project pipeline. So basically, there are 4 categories that you can apply to through the NCRF. Community capacity building and planning is sort of the first section of that pipeline. So this is the initial work, getting together organizations, doing community outreach, deciding what priorities are. A lot of times the output of this would be a local resiliency plan or a small area plan, and sort of gets the community involved, identifies what the priorities are, and then kind of move into the second category of that pipeline, which is site assessment and preliminary design. And this is more of a, doing that initial design work, kind of like a 30% design is what the usual output is. And this really lets organizations have sort of a go or no go decision. We've recognized this as a priority. Is it technically feasible? That moves you into the third category, which is final design and permitting. So this will be moving towards a 90% design or 100% fully completed design, getting all the permitting done, which obviously varies by state. It can be complex and expensive and time consuming. But the idea there is to get projects to that point where they actually are shovel ready. And then the final category we have is that restoration implementation. So this is sort of boots on the ground, actually doing the work to restore natural habitats or reconnect floodplains, anything like that. This is an example from last year. So last year we had 109 proposals that were selected. You can see that in terms of the percentages, we try to have a pretty even slate. So we try to have about 25% to each one of these categories. But of course, restoration and implementation is very expensive, so that's where the kind of the bulk of the funding goes to. And next slide, please. So just in terms of some of the scale and the accomplishments of the NCRF, like I said, we've had about 5 years of grants to this point. So we've invested more than 466 million in over 400 projects. And we've also been able to leverage about 462 million in matching funds and kind donations. So we have a total conservation impact of just over $900 million. Kind of excited to hit the $1 billion mark after this year. It'll be a fun thing for us. But what does it look like on the ground? We've restored 76 miles of beaches and dunes, 48,000 acres of wetlands, 416 acres of marine habitats like corals and SAV. And then in terms of floodplain restoration, we've also restored nearly 21,000 acres. So that's some of the restoration statistics. We've also contributed to a great number of planning efforts and initial design efforts. Still trying to figure out how we can learn sort of the impact of some of those pipeline projects that have gotten funding from other localities and state agencies and resources like that. But just to give you kind of a context of the program that I manage and what we're looking for when we start to kind of get into the goals that we're trying to meet. So next slide, please. So in terms of kind of meeting the goals of the funder and how you can better tell your story when you're applying to funds like this, a few of the previous folks have mentioned, making sure you really thoroughly read the proposal. It sounds very simple, but you'd be amazed how many times people don't really do that. You really want to have a very clear connection to the priorities of the grant. So like I say, in this case with the NCRF, we really need to see both community benefits and ecological benefits. And we've had to say no to very good projects that just don't have those, that don't meet one of those two goals. So, it's kind of a tough balancing act, but, as, practitioners, you have specific priorities and projects that you want to fund. But you also need to make sure that you're not trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. If your project is not aligned with certain goals, you really need to find funding sources that are better equipped to handle it. we still see a lot of projects that are focused on hard infrastructure like flood walls, and it's just not something that we can fund. And so it's a lot of work to put together these full proposals, and we don't want to see people, wasting their time if it's not a very good fit. You want to make sure that there's that really clear connection to a grant priority. In terms of competitiveness, like I said, with this year we got about $750 million in requests for 145 million. So that's, we have to make some pretty hard decisions, and there's a lot of really good grant proposals that we can't fund. So to be competitive, you really have to think about cost effectiveness. Now, in our case, it's a national program, so something that might cost a certain amount of money in Alabama is going to look very different if it's in Alaska or Hawaii, where you have to kind of bring in equipment. We recognize there's going to be a huge range in costs for different projects, but we need to see that the solutions are cost effective, that they are in line with estimates from that region. Like I say, as a funder, you really want to make sure that we're maximizing our impact. So being very mindful about that budget is an important thing. In addition to kind of maximizing your impact, one thing we're thinking about is, how do we take the pot of money we have and get the largest, leverage it for the largest ecological community benefits we can. So that naturally sort of prioritizes larger scale projects. But if you have a smaller project, that doesn't mean you're disqualified. It just means you need to be thinking about, is this project transferable? Is it scalable? Is it innovative? So when we talk about innovation, we're talking about new approaches for enhancing resilience, new strategies. Transferability, is this, a strategy that can be taken within your own region, or is this something that we can be used, across the nation? For example, we funded some marsh terracing work in Louisiana that's now being used in Virginia, in coastal Virginia. And so if you can scale these things, if you can transfer them, if there's the ability to transfer them in other regions, that helps us maximize our impact. So that's a wonderful thing. And then this is an important point. So we're really focused on community-led approaches, community design. So we want to make sure that folks aren't coming in with a proposal that's not been vetted, accepted, and prioritized by the folks who are living in these communities. So community-driven approaches are much more intensive than just having community outreach. It's great to have a flyer or a webinar and let folks know about what you're doing, but we're really trying to find projects that are led by the community. So if that's a design charrette, if you're an organization who's leading folks into the field to do site work or to learn about natural restoration, that much deeper kind of relationship with the community is always something that's going to be scored much higher on our end. And then in terms of building your narrative, one, and I've got, I think my next slide kind of covers this a bit more, but in short, you really want to make sure that we know the sort of the work that's been going into this proposal and the greater context of that work. Is this a living shoreline that just sort of exists by itself, or is this part of a larger strategy to eventually kind of renaturalize the entire segment of the shoreline? Those sorts of that understanding is extremely important to us to be able to make a determination of, how do we make that impact. If it's one of the challenges of having a national grant, but we don't know these areas as well as you do. So we need to learn that broader context to really make sure that we're investing our funding wisely. Like I said, I can expand on that on the next slide if you could advance it, please. Excellent. So in terms of just doing that, considering the bigger picture, how do you do that? One of the easiest things is to identify, has this been a project that's been identified in a local plan or a regional or state plan, a hazard mitigation plan, comprehensive plan? I see a lot of localities doing resiliency planning work now, so it's easier to kind of identify, this is something that has been on the books and identified as a priority for several years. That really helps us know that we're putting our money, investing our money wisely, and then also thinking about the larger actions for these sites. Like I say, there's limited benefits at a smaller segment of living shoreline, but if it's part of a strategy that a community or organization has been adopting, and it's going to lead to more work down the road, more projects, more proposals, that's something that looks very good for us, something that we want to prioritize. Oftentimes we'll see investments that look fairly small scale, but in reality, it's the first leg of a larger watershed-based approach to do restoration work. So when you can show us that context, it becomes, now we realize that we're investing in something that's going to have this much greater impact. So definitely something to consider. And then next slide, please. So this was already kind of talked about a little bit before me, but partnerships and technical expertise, a really important thing for us to know about. Like I say, if this is a region that we're unfamiliar with, or partners that we haven't worked for before, we need to know that the team you have in place has the expertise to do the job, to get successful outcomes. So we want to hear about the kind of work you've done in the past, the scale that you've been working on, and then also on one level there's the work, especially for restoration. But then also, do you have the ability to manage federal funding? Have you had grants with us before, or with other larger funders? We have some tools to kind of help determine that. But it's important for us to know that any group that we're working with has the ability to kind of achieve the outcomes described in the proposals. Next slide, please. So just in terms of kind of how we evaluate proposals, we have a pre-proposal session. So in this year, and typically the timeline is usually about the same, but this year on April 10th was our deadline for pre-proposals. So that's just a two-page document. We don't want to, we know how busy people are. We don't want to give you too much work. So the pre-proposal stage, like I said, we had about 400 folks submit this year. We narrowed that down to about the top 50% of proposals. So I think about 200 folks were invited to the full proposal stage. That's a much more intensive process. The narrative itself is still only 8 pages, but you get a lot of supporting documentation, a lot of letters of support. The budget has to be a lot more finalized at that point. So it's a big lift. So we don't, like I said, we don't want to make people do that work unless we feel like there's a good chance you can get funded. But I can't get into the whole review process, but basically we have a sort of a team. We have the program staff who review these proposals. We also have regional partners. So like I say, if I don't have a lot of experience in Texas, for example, we have partners in Texas who review this work for us. We have an engineering and design firm who will come and look at the feasibility of projects, especially when they're over $5 or $10 million. And then we have external partners who are sort of leaders of the community of practice who look at these as well. In terms of some things that you can think about when you are, when you're writing these proposals, when you think about how they're being evaluated, really useful to start kind of with an elevator pitch. It's one thing if it's the kind of work we've seen before, if it's a pretty standard marsh restoration project, we're all very familiar with that. But we want to encourage innovation, and we want to encourage new ideas, new designs. The challenge with that is sometimes it can be very confusing. You don't always know what you're reviewing. So especially considering the fact that we have a whole range of these different stakeholders reviewing proposals, you want to make sure you can always go back to a really clear, concise ask and plenty of space to elaborate in the full proposal. But if you needed to talk about the project in 1 minute or less, make sure you can do that and then build off of it. In terms of capacity and expertise, we use something called an applicant control questionnaire to kind of get an idea of if you have experience managing these kinds of grants. It's not very intensive. It's like about 5 pages. In fact, I'll get my contact information. If anyone's curious, I'm happy to send out a blank version of it for you. But this is kind of how we know, okay, this group has the expertise and the capacity to handle these grants. And then my next slide is focused on match, so I will advance to that and get into it. So previously, we did require a match, like a 1-to-1 match for projects. We realized that there's a bit of an equity issue involved. Smaller localities or smaller organizations oftentimes just don't have the match available. We don't want to discourage underserved communities from applying. In fact, we really want to encourage them to apply. So we've gotten rid of the requirement to do so. One thing that I've noticed, and I know there's a whole lot of different folks on this call, but since we've taken away the requirement, we're seeing sort of, we need to keep refining this a little bit, because we're seeing huge organizations that will remain nameless, put in projects for $10 million with 0 match. And we are certain that they can provide match there. These are massive national organizations. So if you are a big entity or a big organization, we are expecting it. If you're a smaller locality, smaller organization, it's less of a priority to have it at that point. But one thing I will say is that the match really helps us see that there is, support and community buy-in. That's a really easy way to tell that there's some sweat equity in these projects. So even if you don't have cash match, we value in-kind match and cash the exact same. So you can be very creative in how you can create in-kind match, volunteer hours, in-kind support, deferred costs, discounted fees for services, donated goods. we have a couple examples on this slide here, but if you're using volunteers to do wetland planting or tree planting, all of those things can count, and all of those things show us that you've thought about that aspect of it. There's a lot of community buy-in. So even if you don't have the cash available, I would really encourage folks to focus on ways that you can create in-kind match. So that makes it a lot easier for your proposal to be competitive. Go to the next slide. I'm starting to talk a little, so I'll try to wrap this up quickly. Tips and common mistakes. So like I said, before my work at NIFWF, I was working at a really small nonprofit, and the kinds of funds I was applying to were at the state level or at the regional level. I often knew the folks who were the funders. We'd go get coffee, talk about proposals. They had a really clear idea of the organization I work for, and there was a good kind of give and take there. On the national scale, you're not usually going to have that. So it kind of gets back to that idea of being clear and concise with your elevator pitch. If you don't have an existing relationship with a larger funder, you need to make sure you're very clear on what it is you're asking, because you're not going to have the same level of capacity to go back and talk through ideas and hash out differences to get a grant. Also, starting early. People will always tell you that you have to start early. Even if you feel like you can wrap a proposal quickly, there's always technical grants or technical issues. We use a system called Easy Grants. It is not easy. That is a misnomer. There are always technical issues that come up. And if it's the day before proposals due, we're getting hundreds of emails. There's no guarantee that we can actually get to you in time. The system for award management, Sam was mentioned, that sometimes can take a month or longer to get information from when you're registering for the first time. So you can't just hold off on those things. You really have to get that stuff done as soon as you can. Clear budget, timeline, work plan, extremely important. A lot of times, like I say, we have a finite source of money and a lot of ask. Sometimes we want to offer smaller grants. We can't really do that unless we have a very clear idea of what each component that you're trying to fund is. So the work plan helps us know that you have the expertise and a good plan in place to get the work done. The very clear budget lets us see exactly what we're funding and lets us go ahead and offer you partial funding if that's all we can do. Prioritize feedback and ask questions. So one of the parts of my job is to make sure that we have the strongest proposals possible. So we do a lot of things to try to help grantees. We provide feedback. We do these proposal labs where we just meet and talk about ideas and answer any questions people have. We have a group of field liaisons who come out and help you develop proposals. We have like a 40-page frequently asked questions document, tips and tricks, excuse me. And we have tools as well, and I'll show one in a second. But we have a lot of resources that we've invested in to try to make proposals as strong as possible, and we really want to work with applicants. So listen to the feedback and take it into account, and then when you have questions, just reach out. We always, like I said, it's part of my job to make sure that these are strong proposals, and we want to work with as many folks as we can. So we want those coming in as strong as possible. We can go to the next slide. I realize I'm a little bit over time. So this is just an example, some of the field liaisons we work with. If you do apply to an NCRF fund, we can just link you their information. It's a free service that we pay for. So it's something that you should definitely take advantage of, especially if you haven't had a grant through NIFWF before. Next slide, please. So these next two slides are something you can kind of take a look at after the webinar today. This is a tool that we've invested in to sort of help identify landscapes that have the maximum benefit for fish and wildlife. It's a great resource. You can use it, and because we've invested in it, if you take a look at this and kind of add it into your proposal, that's going to help look stronger as well. The link is on the next slide. We can fast forward to that. So take a look. Let me know if you have any questions. Also, you can use this for other grants. It doesn't have to necessarily be a NIFWF grant. It's a really valuable tool. So the last slide is just my contact information, as well as contact information for the other managers and our program director. We can advance that slide if you'd like to. And say, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to answer any questions during that session. But also, if you have any questions about this or making stronger proposals, just give me a call or send me an email. Always happy to help out. And sorry for being a couple minutes over.
You're fine, Ross. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. If you have any questions, Ross is going to stick around for the Q&A. Our next speaker is Christina Mormon. She's with the Gulf of Mexico Alliance, and she's going to talk a little bit also from the funder's perspective from the funding that they have. So Christina, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. So Rhonda, Kiama, and Ross have talked about how to approach a grant proposal from your side of the project, things like your project team, the work you're going to do, and how to tell your story. I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about getting to know your funder and ways that that can help improve your proposal. Next slide. So here's a brief overview of what I plan to cover. First, why getting to know your funder matters. Next, where to look for information about your funder, their mission, and their goals. This will include an example where we'll walk through the process to give you a feel for what it looks like in practice. And finally, Jody asked me to talk a little bit about the Gulf of Mexico Alliance and our role as a regional funder. So I'm going to touch a little bit on our process and how we work. Next slide. So first of all, why does it matter? Why is it important to get to know your funder? First, it confirms that applying for the funds is a good use of your time. Successful proposals must support the organization's mission and goals, and you want to make sure the funding organization is one you want to be aligned with. So do they have a track record of success? Do they have priorities that match your mission and values, or priorities that might go against the mission and values of your organization? And second, it ensures you're meeting the criteria in the call for funding. So many applications require you to describe how your proposal aligns with the organization. And we'll talk about this in a bit more detail, but it often includes that you show your project meets activities in their strategic plan or meets their management goals. And so, for example, Ross mentioned this a little bit specific to NIFWIF, and so we'll go into a little bit more detail about that. And finally, getting to know your funder gives you insights that will strengthen your proposal. What does the organization value, and how can you incorporate that into your proposal? And things like what wording resonates with them. So are there certain terms that they're using to describe their work that you can incorporate into your proposal writing? Are there certain buzzwords that they're using that you can add to your narrative so that the work you're describing resonates with the funder? Next slide. And so we've talked about this a little bit in some of the other presentations as well, but funders put out opportunities as a way to accomplish their mission and goals for their organization. And so you want to make sure that your project fills that role and is a good fit. It's not just about finding a way to fund the work that you want to do. It's about finding the right match between your project and a potential funder. And that's really your key to success, is finding a good match between what you want to do and the funding opportunities that are available. Next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit more about where to look and look at examples of where you might find information you need, plus some of the keywords that are going to help you look for the information that you need. And so Kiama talked a little bit about some of the terminology for grants like RFP, RFA, NOFO. I used RFP in my presentation, but you can just think of call for proposals or RFP, but also some of those terms that you might have heard earlier in the webinar. And so information about the funding organization, their mission, and their priorities is usually found in the background section, and that's at the beginning of the call for proposals or in the opportunity description. And again, that's usually at the beginning of the call for proposals. So when you look at the RFP, the first part is the background and the information about the organization and the opportunity. And so that's usually the place where you'll find the information about the funder. Next slide. So these are some keywords that you can look for when you're reading through the proposal that will help you out. So when an organization is talking about who they are, you'll see words like their mission and their purpose and their vision. And so that gives you some clues about who they are and what their priorities are. And then you might see words like goals and priorities that tell you what types of efforts they want to support broadly, and also specifically what they're targeting for this funding opportunity. And then you might see things like their strategic plan or a management plan mentioned, or other similar documents that are going to lead you to more specific information you need. And a lot of times you'll see words like support or align. So for example, you might see a sentence in the RFP that says, projects should align with our mission and address specific priorities in our management plan. That's a whole lot of keywords that tell you this is a place where you need to pay attention because these are the things that we want you to focus on that are related to our organization and our priorities. Next slide. So here's an example. This is from an RFP that was put out by the EPA's Gulf of Mexico division. And I've highlighted in the first box where they mention their mission. So they specifically say to carry out our mission. And then they go on to describe how they want to maintain and expand partnerships with different types of agencies and organizations. And they even provide a link to their website where you can go for more information. So that's a clue to you that that section has the information that you need about who they are and their mission. And then in the second box, I've highlighted where they go on to talk about how awards specific for this call to proposals should be in support of their strategic plan. And they've even put in a link to the strategic plan so that you can go to the website and read it. And they specifically say awards should support specific goals that should be addressed. So this is just an example of what some of the wording will look like. But like I said, you can look for those keywords to give you some ideas of where the information is about mission, priorities, and their strategic plans. A lot of times they'll link out like this to a strategic plan or another document that's a priority. Next slide. So next, we're going to talk about some other places to find information about the funding organization beyond just the RFP. Go ahead. So a great place to look for more information is to explore the types of projects that have already been funded. And you can look for a list of projects on their website. Most organizations are going to highlight their funded work. And many also have news releases where they talk about recently funded projects as well. So they'll have a news section with press releases about their projects, or maybe links to places where it's been covered in the local media, those types of things. And so by looking into the types of projects that have been funded, it can give you insights into how projects address the mission and vision. So what's the connection between their mission and the ways that they invest to make that happen? And so you can start to think about if your project is a good fit for the same type of work, if it's in line with the types of things that they previously funded. And you can also gain insight into the types of organizations that they fund. So a lot of times an RFP will have a broad list of the types of organizations that it might fund, like universities, nonprofits, community-based organizations, and large national organizations as well. And so you might have this long list of organizations who are eligible to apply, but you might see a pattern in the actual projects that they fund where they tend to fund a lot of projects to academic partners, or they tend to fund a lot of projects to on-the-ground community-based organizations. And so that gives you an idea, again, if your organization is a good match for the types of organizations who they typically fund the most. And finally, what types of projects do they fund? Do they fund projects that are really research oriented? Do they fund projects that are on the ground? Do they fund projects that are really focused on metrics and results? And so you need to make sure that that's a major component of your proposal. And things like, do they fund projects that have a strong education component or a strong volunteer component? So those are all things that you can look at to make sure that your project's a fit, and to make sure that you're adding those components to help make your proposal more successful. Next slide. So another way to get to know your funder is to reach out and talk to them during the application process. We've talked a little bit about this. Funders want you to have the best chance of success when you apply. So don't hesitate to reach out if you need more information. But like Ross said, don't wait till the last minute because they tend to get flooded with questions right at the end. So make sure you're starting well in advance, you're reaching out well in advance of that deadline to make sure there's time to get your questions answered. So all funding proposals are going to have contact information. They're going to have an email for you to reach out to someone who's managing questions for the funding opportunity. So that's a great place to start. Many proposals are going to have an overview webinar, and or they're going to post responses to questions from other applicants. So those are other places where you can get more information about the organization, and then also the types of specifics that they're looking for this particular funding opportunity. And finally, some funding proposals include things like office hours, technical support, or other assistance where you can ask questions and get more direct feedback on your project concept. So it really depends on the organization, but you'll see this with some organizations where they have specific opportunities for you to connect one-on-one with the funder to make sure that what you are proposing is aligned with what they intend for the funding opportunity. Next slide. So some other ways to get to know an organization: look at their website. That again just gives you an idea for who they are, the types of work that they fund, what their key priorities are. Look at their other communications. So things like press releases. This is a screenshot from NIFWIF. These are all press releases about funding announcements. So here's the type of work that we're funding. Here's a press release about it. Things like a newsletter, these are all great places where you're going to find out more about the organization and the type of work that they do. So it just helps you get a more complete picture of who they are and what they do. And then also events like conferences and meetings. I'll talk a little bit more about this with the Gulf of Mexico Alliance specifically, but a great way to get to know us and to get to know the types of projects that we're funding and get to know the opportunities that are available is to attend our in-person meetings. Same with the Climate and Resilience Community of Practice. Attending the annual meeting is a great way to find out about the types of work that's going on and the types of opportunities that are available. Next slide. So here's an example. We're going to put it all together. So this is part of a call from a RFP put out by NOAA's Marine Debris Program. And so imagine that your organization is looking to remove abandoned and derelict vessels and other large marine debris. So you want to go out and you want to clear derelict and abandoned boats from waters in your state or waters in your region. And so you see this funding opportunity, and you see that keyword there that the mission of the Marine Debris Program includes removal activities. So I circled removal. So you can see like the first box gets checked. Okay, this fits the mission of this funder, and so far it seems like a good match. Next slide. So you keep going through and you see information about their priorities, and they have a strategic plan. They've called out some specific strategic plans and documents that you can use as reference. So one of them is the Marine Debris Program Strategic Plan. I went to the NOAA website and I pulled up their strategic plan, and one of their goals is removal, and it specifically talks about the types of removal activities that they support, some of their goals, some of their objectives. So after reading that, you can say, okay, great, this fits their strategic plan as well, and you can give a check for that. And then next, go to their website, you look around at some of the other types of projects that they funded, and you see that they've funded similar projects to remove derelict and abandoned vessels nationwide in specific states. They've built new programs and expanded capacity. So you're seeing a lot of information about similar projects that gives you the information you need to say, yes, they fund similar projects, and you can give a check for that as well. Okay, and so finally, you have done your homework, you've gotten to know the organization, and you can say it also funds organizations similar to yours. So you're seeing other nonprofits, for example, that have been funded. it aligns with your organization's mission and values. You both have a priority to remove marine debris from the environment. And you've also been able to tell that this funder has a great positive reputation and a proven track record for funding. So you put all of that together, you submit your proposal, you're successful. This example, this is a project that was funded for GOMA to remove marine debris. So we're actually doing this work. And this is the process that we used. We made sure that it aligned with the organization's mission, that the types of projects that they fund were a good fit. So this is an example from real life. This is an example from the process that we've gone through. Next slide. Okay, and so finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about who we are and our process. And so GOMA is a regional partnership. We work across the 5 Gulf states. We're focused on improving the environmental and economic health of the region. And we work with state and federal agencies, nonprofits, academics, business and industry, bringing everybody together, providing forums for collaboration, and then also funding projects on the ground to do work that improves the Gulf of Mexico. And so some of our priority issues that we work on are things like environmental education, clean water, resilient communities, habitats and wildlife, and marine debris. And we believe and feel really strongly that working together, we can achieve more than any single organization can accomplish alone. And so that's a big part of what drives us, is bringing together different organizations and building partnerships. And so really briefly, our process. So this is our governor's action plan. This is our strategic plan that we use. So the 5 states and partners identify priorities and actions, and those are in our action plan. So that's whenever we put out a funding opportunity, that's what we go back to say, this is our strategic plan. Everything that we fund needs to accomplish an action that we've identified in this plan. And so for each of the priorities that we work on, things like education and habitat resources, wildlife and fisheries, marine debris, we have groups of people who are working on those issues who come together and collaboratively identify and prioritize activities that accomplish those actions. And like I said, we do that through meetings and discussions. And so we have team meetings, and then we also have in-person meetings, our all hands meeting, where all of the teams come together to talk about potential projects, talk about potential activities, and prioritize the work that they want to do to accomplish actions in the action plan. And so some of that is accomplished through capacity building. Some of it is projects that need funding. And so for projects that need funding, the teams either get specific information from project concept pitches. So it's a collaborative process working with a partner who has a project idea that meets these actions and needs funding. And sometimes we put out an RFP. So if we have an idea of the action that we want to accomplish, but we don't know specifically who would do that work or specifically what the project details would be to accomplish that action, then we'll put out an RFP. And so, for example, we're going to put out a few RFPs later this year for our coastal community resilience team and for our habitat resources team, where we have an idea of the work that needs to be done, but we don't have a specific partner identified, and that'll be an open RFP that anyone can apply to. And so, like I said, beyond the RFP, getting to know GOMA, here's a few ways that you can get to know us. Join a team. So this is the best way to learn about funding opportunities and the types of things that we're working on. You can sign up on our website, and I'm going to have a QR code for that on the next slide. You can attend our meetings and webinars. Like I was talking about, getting to know the types of projects that are funded by an organization. We have a webinar every other month where we highlight one of the projects that we're working on. So that's a great way to get to know us as a funder and get to know the type of work that we do. And then also we have a monthly newsletter where we talk about project updates, we announce funding opportunities, share information about our teams and our meetings, and we also have social media. So this is specific for GOMA, but it's also a great example of how you can get to know any funding organization that you might want to partner with. And that's the end of my presentation. I encourage you, if you have questions and want to know more information, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can send me an email. If you're interested in getting to know more about GOMA, that QR code will send you straight to sign up for our mailing list. And you can also follow us on social media.
Thank you, Christina. Next presenter is Dennis McGurry. He's with the Grand Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. And we've talked a little bit around budgets, and he's going to talk to us more in depth about developing a budget and a budget narrative. Dennis, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, hey everyone. So yeah, going to talk a little bit about one of the more objective components of the application, the budget and the budget narrative, and we'll also talk a little bit about match and ways that you can find match besides just cash. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. All the stuff that I'm talking about today too can be found in the Code of Federal Regulations, Title II. Most of the 200s is where you can find it, pretty much that whole block. So I think something, important to mention before even getting into budgets is, and most of us know this, just the need for transparency around bookkeeping methods, whether you're, applying for federal funds or, funds from a foundation, whatever the case, the funders are definitely going to want to know how that money is being spent and making sure it's all being spent wisely. So, good bookkeeping methods by your organization, I think is something that's really important. Also, understanding, the funders' requirements. You want to make sure that you're applying to something that fits your project. So, that's something that's very important as well. So you can switch to the next slide. So first up, I just wanted to mention some pretty general categories, budget categories. These are pulled off of standard form 424, off of grants.gov. You've got personnel, fringe benefits, travel, equipment, which is usually things that last, property that lasts, over a year and is valued over 5,000. But there are exceptions to that, and I'll talk about how to kind of document that when we get to the budget narrative part. Supplies, contractual, which are services, construction, which aren't always included in every funding opportunity. Then you kind of have your hodgepodge category, other, and that covers, your direct charges. And then you have indirect charges. Go ahead and advance. So this slide here, this table, just shows, kind of how important format is. These are from, several different funders. We've got NOAA, NIFWIF, National Academy of Sciences, and to show you kind of how their budget categories are laid out in some of the funding opportunities. They're different. In NIFWIF and NAS, they include fringe right there in the personnel category. NOAA likes to see that separated out. Moving down to the contractual part, NIFWIF and NAS, they keep subawards and contracts together, whereas NOAA likes to see those in their other category. So that's just goes to show, if they provide you a template, I would definitely suggest using that. Okay, next. So probably one of the most difficult parts of composing a budget is estimating the cost. You want to make sure, that you have enough funds to complete your project, but you want to make sure that you're not asking for too many funds. So, when you're dealing with mileage, lodging, per diem, meals, incidentals, those kinds of things, gsa.gov is a really good site to get all those government rates. Beyond that, just doing some research. If you're looking at materials and supplies, I like to look for a couple different sources and then, maybe take an average of that. If you're dealing with, contractual services or subawards, those types of things, go ahead and reach out to those entities and have them provide you with a budget, or just simply, talking to someone that deals in the same sort of projects that you are trying to accomplish, and someone who has a good hand on that kind of stuff, and see what those costs are. And then, quotes are also a really good way to get those estimations. Okay, advance, please. So indirect costs, those are your overhead costs to run your organization, and those are usually determined by a NICRA, a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, and those will be calculated as a percentage of modified total direct costs, which are usually all direct costs except for equipment, participant support costs, things like stipends, and portions of the subaward that are over the first 25,000. Now, if you don't have a NICRA, you can still ask for indirect. There is a standard de minimis rate of 10% that's acceptable to use, and some funders will actually let you use more than a 10%, but those are heavily scrutinized. So just a heads up about that. When in doubt, just kind of reach out to your funder to ask those questions. Go ahead and advance, please. But not to worry, because you are still, you can still move funds around after you do, if you do receive funding. It's acceptable to move, 10% or less of your total budget between categories. However, without a rebudget. Sorry, I should say that. However, if that results in a change of scope, or a change in key personnel, or even, simply a new subaward or contract, or transferring participant support funds, that is a definite sign that you should, reach out to your funder, and there's that possibility there that you would need to do a rebudget. Okay, advance. So that brings us to budget narratives. So this is where you justify the funds that you're asking for. Again, templates are, if they offer them, which usually they do, then I would suggest using those. A lot of normally funders like to see, your calculations, or it's always a good practice to link back to objectives and tasks in your narrative. And I've got a couple examples to show you guys. The first few, go ahead and advance, are just to kind of show the different formats of budget narratives. So this is an example from one of the recent NOAA BIL competitions. So they like to see these tables at the beginning, which makes it really nice for reviewers, because everything's right there. However, it does make for a very long budget narrative. But notice in the description part, we're talking about responsibilities of the position. We're talking about how that position relates back to program objectives and parts of the project that we are proposing. And we've also talked about the annual effort for that position. And then if you look down towards the end, we are also anticipating, raises, or just a small justification there, or, adjusted costs of living. Those things are perfectly allowable. But you want to make sure that you know, add a little justification in your narrative. Go ahead and advance. Now this is a continuation. Again, Noah likes these tables at the beginning, and with this particular competition, they wanted to see how fringe benefits were broken down. Now this is the only time I've seen this when applying for funding, but again, just to kind of throw that out there that you know, it definitely doesn't hurt. The more information that you put in here is, you know, is always a good thing. So go ahead and advance. Now, this is kind of the opposite of, you know, a very intense, you know, there's no tables in this one. This is an example from a NAS budget narrative, but, you know, again, we are talking about, you know, the percent effort. We are talking about, you know, position responsibilities and how those link back to the project narrative. Okay, advance. And this is a budget narrative example from NIFWIF proposal. Now this they have their own grant system. It's easy grants. Ross was talking about it earlier. So this one it looks a little less intensive because this was all, you know, entered into a text box. But again, it's the same thing. You know, we're talking about what the responsibilities are of the personnel and how those relate back to project tasks. Next, please. And this here is an example of documenting the some of the exceptions. I mentioned earlier about equipment that there could be exceptions. So the Mississippi State personnel or the Mississippi State procurement system, they see all kinds of different things as equipment. It doesn't have to necessarily be, you know, 5,000. But it has to do with how long they last and, you know, what they are. So in order to keep things easy to track, we put those when we were applying for proposals, we go ahead and we put those things in the equipment category so we don't have to move funds around later. So you can see we added a justification there to the top, just saying, you know, we're including these in equipment because of how they hit the state procurement system. Okay, you can advance. And this is an example of, you know, showing calculations. So this is sort of a less intensive version, and I'll show you the next slide. I'll have a little bit more intensive version, but so basically what we're doing here is, you know, we've talked about our total, and we have you know, we're basically saying we want this many of this item, and this is how much they'll cost. But we've also included things like shipping expenses, again, because this is how it hits our procurement sites. And so, you know, we're not exactly sure what those shipping expenses are, but, you know, we did mention that you know, those expenses will be in here as well. Go ahead and advance. Okay, so this is a little bit more specific. So when dealing with stipends, they can always be kind of tricky. And I think, you know, funders like to see, you know, how you're calculating these stipends. You know, it's easy to come in here to go into these things and say, okay, you know, 5,000 or 500 or 1,000 sounds like a good number to offer folks for, you know, attending meetings or what have you. But it's always good to show how you get those calculations. So this stipend, you know, was meant to offset costs associated with childcare, potential lost wages, and travel for participants in some meetings that we were proposing. So what we did was we looked at census data for income for that area. We also looked at a child care market survey published by the Mississippi Department of Human Services to pull some of the hourly child care rates. And then we used, you know, just average gas prices instead of the government mileage rate here. And then, we simply rounded that up. And so we showed how that's how we came up with those stipends. And then moving down to the third bullet there, where I have that part highlighted again. We're talking about how we came up with these numbers based on average pricing using, several online service sources and past workshop and meeting experience. You can advance. So this slide is just showing, this example is just showing that you definitely want to, mention how you're calculating your modified total direct cost, because it's not always the same. So here we're talking about the percentage on all direct costs except for the pass-through funds, including equipment, tuition, participant support, and then the excess of that 25,000 on subawards. Okay, advance, please. And that brings us to match. I think, with match, this turns a lot of people away from even applying to certain opportunities. But it doesn't have to be that scary or that difficult. There are lots of ways you can come up with match. I think just the main things to remember are, that these things, they have to be tracked, which can be difficult. I think that depends on, what those accounting methods that your organization has in place. And then also, once something you use it for match, you can only use it for one project. So go ahead and advance. Reasons why you would need match, the obvious reason, some funders require it, but it's a great way to share cost, promote sustainability of the project. And even if it's, not required, it's a really good way to show that, your organization or your community is committed to your project. Next, please. So when calculating match, I think it's important, really quickly just to mention that, if you've got a 50% or one-to-one match, that is the percentage of your project total, not of the share that you're asking for. So if you have a $200,000 project, your match is going to be 100,000, and your federal share, the amount of money that you're going to be asking for, is 100,000. If you were to take the percentage 50% out of the amount you're asking for, then you would come up short of a $200,000 project. It would be 150,000 that you'd be getting there. Next example, 20% match. Your project total is 100,000, federal share is 80, and your match is 20K. Next, please. So cash match, that's probably the easiest to track, but also I think for most folks, that's the hardest to come by. So cash match can be, non-federal funds that your organization might have, non-federal funds from a third party or a partner, or, fundraisers are another really good way to get cash match. But there are other ways, in kind. You can advance, please. In kind match, that's another way. As long as these are eligible project expenses, I think a good way to think of it is, if there is a line item in your budget for this, or if there could be a line item in your budget, then it's fair game for in-kind match. So services or something, training for project staff, volunteers, expert services for the project. When you're thinking about these trainings, the trainers, you can use their time to lead the event. You can use expenses incurred for traveling to and from the event. as well as those attending, your project staff and volunteers. If the training, takes place at a donated office or a large meeting space somewhere, you can use the fair market value for renting that space as well as match. Staff time is a really good one to use, volunteer time as well. Go ahead and advance. Goods are also acceptable. Equipment rental, material supplies that are donated. These kinds of things are really good sources of match. You can also advance, please. You could also use property, that is tied with the project, a land or a facility, value of rental or lease. But all of these things, need to be documented. So go ahead and advance. When you are thinking about documenting these things, like going into the application, letters of commitment are always good, whether it's from your organization or somewhere else, just showing that they're dedicated to the project and they understand what they are offering up for in-kind match or cash match. And then after the award, cost centers or charge codes, specific for that match, or, if other accounting policies, set forth by your organization, these kinds of things are definitely necessary to track this stuff. And then when you're valuing, these in-kind sources, fair market value is always what you should use when you're dealing with property, equipment, materials, or or things like that. And then, when you're thinking about, people's time, volunteers or staff, you want to make sure that you use what the published range for that position is, the current or regular pay rate. With volunteers, what is ordinarily paid to someone who is performing those same sort of duties in your organization. And then fringe benefits are also something that are acceptable to use as in kind. And then, travel expenses like airline tickets and bus fares, and, certain supplies, all of that stuff can be recorded at, the receipt value. But, I think, again, what's important to remember is just that all of this stuff is subject to audit, and you definitely don't want to be on the wrong side of one of those. So, overmatching is not advisable. It's perfectly acceptable once you do, if you were to hit, your match goal in the middle of a project to simply stop counting. Because again, all of that stuff is subject to audit if you report it. And that's all I have.
All right. Thank you, Dennis. That was very informative. The questions are rolling in on chat. Please keep them in, rolling. Please keep putting your questions in the chat box, and we will have another Q&A at the end of the webinar. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Tracy Simpier. She's going to talk to us about what not to do when writing a grant.
Hey, well, good afternoon. It's great to be here with you today. A lot of the things that folks have already said throughout the morning, I'm going to be reiterating, but I'm hoping I'll be able to give you a couple of examples. Just to let you know, a lot of us find ourselves in positions where we not only write grants for our work, but we also find ourselves in our professional or personal lives, being on the opposite end, like being a reviewer or maybe even leading a panel for this. So I just want to share with you a couple of things that I've seen over my career that tend to be things that people have done that could be avoided probably pretty easily. And I don't have a whole lot of slides, but I will try to give you a couple of examples in these slides. So I'm just going to talk about some general mistakes first. And you've already heard almost every presenter talk about the first one, not following the instructions and reading thoroughly the funding announcement This is how grantors are able to kind of pare down. I mean, you heard Ross talk about the hundreds of applications and pre-proposals that they receive through NIF with. I mean, one really easy way to maybe pare that down real quickly is just if people didn't follow directions, kind of take them out of the pot, or they're not at the highest competition level at that point. Let me give you a real specific example for a proposal that I submitted recently. When it talks about following the instructions, I submitted with a team of other scientists for a National Science Foundation proposal, and we gave ourselves plenty of time. We got down to really about the week before this was due, which is why you want to give yourself plenty of time. And NSF has very specific requirements. You have to have an NSF ID before you can even be a co-PI on a project, but you also have a very specific way that they have for you set up to submit your current and pending, your CV, all of those kinds of things. And so I got an email one night from the PI, the lead PI on the grant, and she said, well, she said, I was reading through the announcement and again, and noticed that when you submit your current and pending, they want a specific code at the beginning of your title. And none of us did that. You know, we all just wrote the name of the pending thing. So what that required is for each individual co-PI to go back into their individual NSF accounts, redo the current and pending, recertify it, and then send that back to the PI. So sometimes it can be little things like that, you know, maybe you didn't catch it the first time that you were reading through it, but then on the other end of it, you're like, oh man, you know, that they asked for it, it's in writing. And so you kind of have to go back and think through that. So that's just a quick example. Not researching the funder's interest, that was just very well articulated, I believe, with Ross and Christina earlier. And sometimes it's just not just knowing a little bit about their mission, right? If you notice, both of them went into a lot of specifics about, you know, exactly what kinds of projects they like to fund. And so that is really important. Okay, here's one I've seen is when I've take off my writing a proposal hat and put on my reviewer hat. There's been a lot of times where there's some careless editing, right? You know, people are in that final hour, they're just trying to get the narrative finished. Maybe there's some pieces and then, you know, they don't spell check it, or they use acronyms in there that maybe they haven't identified earlier on in the proposal, or just, you know, just having somebody proofread your work, right? So important. One of the things that I know I found really confusing as a reviewer is sometimes, like, when you start a project, you have this really great idea for a title, and we're going to call this group the so-and-so, and you give them a name. Well, I've read proposals where halfway through the proposal, they changed the name of that group. And I was pretty confused. I thought it was two different things until I reread and realized, oh, they must have decided to change it. And then they just had careless editing. They didn't go back and change it everywhere in the narrative. And so those things put a lot of extra load on your reviewers, and it makes it hard for them to pay attention to what you're saying if you haven't edited. So that's also true if you have a lot of people helping you and you're writing the proposal together and people have different writing styles. It's important to go back and make sure there's some things you might want to repeat in a lot of different ways, but there's other things that you want to save that space in the proposal. So you just need to make sure that your writing styles align and that you haven't gone overboard telling them the same things, you know, over and over again. And then the last one on this slide is assuming the reviewer knows more than they do. So when I'm writing a proposal, and I think others on this that are helping with this webinar would agree that sometimes the person that's reviewing, they might be an expert in a specific field, but they might not know anything about your organization, right? Because may or may not be somebody from the same region. They might not know the lingo. So you really have to spell it out, not use jargon, and avoid catchphrases. So just kind of pretend like your reviewer doesn't really have the background and you have to kind of spoon feed that to them. They will appreciate it, even if you feel like it's something that most people would know. Okay, Dennis did a great job covering budgets, but these are some of the mistakes that I have seen when going through and reviewing proposals. So I, in my personal hat, taking off my professional hat, I serve on the educational foundation board for my local school district, and we do a teacher granting, a small grant teacher grant program every year. And it never fails that every year teachers will submit grants to us and they won't even tell us how much money they're asking for. And I know that you feel like, how could people forget to include that, right? Well, depending upon the funding opportunity, it might be really well spelled out, like the ones that Dennis just gave us all those great examples of. But it might also, from a different organization, just especially like a foundation that you might be applying to a private foundation, it might just tell you to include a budget and you might miss that line. So just be sure that you're very explicit about how much you're asking for from the organization. And then I've seen this all too often where people ask for the wrong amounts. So if they give you a cap and they have a minimum and a maximum, you need to stay within that cap that they give you. I can't tell you how many times I've seen proposals that did not even get a review because they didn't follow those directions. So maybe they weren't asking for enough, or maybe they went over the amount that was allotted. Now, a lot of times they'll give you a total amount that they expect to fund, and you can kind of figure out what that appropriate amount for you to ask for could be by dividing that number of awards in that maximum amount that they're going to allow. So you can kind of be like, okay, well, I could ask for between 50 and 150K on this project based upon the number of awards that they're going to give out. I've seen a lot of people submit sloppy budgets where I didn't quite understand what they were requesting or why they were requesting it. So if you have left out a major item, those reviewers are going to know. They're going to say, this is really strange. They're hiring this new person for this position. There's not any equipment at all. That person's going to need a computer. Let's just say that you are going to hire that person and you didn't put a computer in the budget because you knew that that was something that you could provide in kind, like what Dennis was talking about earlier in the budgets. Then you need to make sure that you explicitly talk about that in the budget narrative, because if you don't, they're going to think that you're not equipped to do those things. Also, that's where you would put in information about leveraging funds so that they would know, oh, you have funds to do this portion, you just need these funds to do that. But if you leave that part out, your reviewer's not going to know, and they're going to think that maybe you haven't worked with these kinds of large projects before and that you're not equipped to do it. So just be sure not to make sure it's very neat and clear. Okay, I know this goes without saying, but you don't want to submit a proposal late. It happens all the time. Agencies get late proposals all the time with people expecting them to be reviewed. You would think it doesn't happen. It absolutely happens. In most cases, they're not even scored. I know that through the organization that I work with professionally here at Sea Grant, if you miss the deadline, you don't get considered. So do not expect a deadline extension. If one is given, that's great, but don't expect that it will happen. A lot of times people wait till the last minute to submit, and you've heard a lot of people already this morning talking about why that's not a good idea. A lot of times these systems can be slow when you're submitting, or in some cases, I know a lot of times people will be like, oh, I'm just waiting for that last letter of support to come in, that last letter of support. Well, most systems, like for instance, if you have like one document that you're waiting on, everything else can be uploaded. Do everything that you possibly can. You can always re-upload before you submit, re-upload that narrative, and then, or that letter of support, whatever was missing. So just make sure that you don't wait till the last minute. And things like what I was just describing earlier can come up, like where, oh, they needed us to put a specific title on something. Not applying in the first place. I have to put this on here because I think it can be intimidating to apply for grants sometimes, but if you don't apply, you're never going to know, right? And some places, you should not expect probably your very first proposal that you submit to get funded, but having that initial submission will give you some great feedback from most organizations about what you should be doing different, so that then you're ready to submit a stronger proposal in the future that can be funded. So I just wanted to mention that. Okay, a couple of other things. The proposal lacks significance. In some cases, when people have prepared narratives, and I've read through those, and they clearly have a great scientific method for what they're doing. In some cases, they have really clearly laid out the hypothesis. but maybe by the end of that, you're still not really sure how that's going to impact maybe a particular audience. Like you're not really sure what the significance, okay, even if you do this and you test this hypothesis, what is that going to actually do? How's that information going to be used, right? How is it going to be applicable? Is it contributing to the greater body of science? Is it helping a community in some way, the results of that? So just make sure that your proposal has very clearly articulated what the impact and the significance is of what you're doing. I've seen a lot of people with the second bullet here have overambitious aims. They pretty much tell you they can do all these things with sometimes a very minimum amount of money, and they haven't really explained how, oh, well, they're leveraging another project, like I mentioned earlier, or this is the second phase of a project we've already started. And that's really hard for a reviewer that doesn't have that context. So just make sure that you're realistic about what you can accomplish in the time frame, and that if for some reason you think that your goals might seem overambitious to the reviewer, that you explain how it's a continuation or an add-on of a project you've done in the past. And then I like to talk about this other one. I call it domino aims, or I've heard it called domino aims. So if your project relies on the successful completion of another project, then somewhere in that narrative, that reviewer is going to want to see that there's some data that supports that this other project is going to be successful, right? Or how it's going, because it's really hard for someone to want to give funding to a project that's contingent upon something else. So if you can, it's kind of nice to already have like some results or some evaluation from maybe a project that you're sort of relying on for information, so that then the reviewer can kind of trust that then you're going to be able to carry out this maybe second portion or implementation portion of a project. So, but it is hard for a reviewer and, to get on board with something that they know is contingent on something else. So just remember that, it's nice if you can show a great completed project, or maybe even a really great needs assessment that you've completed, that then will help as a basis for your new project. And with that, Jody, I'm just going to leave my contact information in case folks have questions, and then turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Tracy. And yes, please continue to put questions in the chat box. If you don't mind, Tracy, forwarding to the next slide. I'm up to finish this out, and I have just uploaded a couple of files into the chat box. We will also be sending these resources, a link to these resources, out later. But to wrap up, we've gotten a lot of good information about how to write a grant today and what not to do. So finally, I want to talk to you a little bit about where are you going to find some opportunities for climate and resilient funding. Next slide, Tracy, please. Like I said, we covered a lot today. We talked about elements of your proposal, how to tell your story, how to know your funder, common mistakes, and those ever fun budget narratives and budget match. But who are you going to submit that to? Next slide, please, Tracy. So there's a lot of different resources out there. We have your individual state has resources. They may have different capacities for funding. So you may have an environmental protection department. You may have Office of Coastal Management that may have funding. There's also state revolving funds that might be accessible to you or to your organization to implement those climate and resilient projects you may have. We've talked a lot about federal funding resources. NOAA, FEMA hasn't been mentioned. Also, offices like the Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS, they have funding available that can be applicable to projects you may have for climate and resilient protection. Different organizations and partners. So we've heard from NIFWF, National Fish and Wildlife Federation. They have a lot of good funding out there. The Gulf of Mexico Alliance has some funding available. Also, soil and water conservation districts. You have one in your county or your area, your region, that might have funding available. And sometimes these RFPs are a lot less formal than some of our federal RFPs are. And then private foundations, we've heard a couple of them mentioned. There's a couple in the document that they put out there. These are just examples. It may be a national foundation, but it also might be a regional or a state foundation. So keep those in mind as you put together your projects, who might be able to fund you. Next slide, please, Tracy. There's a lot of great boards, listings, and newsletters. You do have to put research into finding funding opportunities, and sometimes that involves going out and looking for funds instead of waiting for an email to come across your desk that something's out there. GOMA has a great funding opportunities board on their website. It's very easy to see and links right to those calls for proposals that are out there. The EPA has a climate change and adaptation resource center, and the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit funding opportunities, which is a NOAA tool. All of those are listed in that handout that I gave you, but that's another good way to, just every so often go on and see what's out there and what's available. Like everyone has emphasized, timing is everything, and having formerly worked for a university, it's really hard to see that a grant is that has a deadline of a week from now to be able to get everything, not only everything together, but get it through all the channels on your end to make sure that you're ready to put in that proposal. And one more slide, Tracy. We will have, as I've mentioned, all of these resources in a link that we will send out to you once we get everything uploaded, sometime in the next week or so. So just be on the lookout for that. Before we move to Q&A, I just want to thank all of our great speakers today for taking their time to do this. I think there was a lot of good information. I want to thank all of the attendees that sat through, almost 2.5 hours of this workshop online. I hope that you got what you needed out of it. I want to thank our sponsors and the National Academies of Science, who we have received funding for this project for. I will be dropping that evaluation link here in the chat in just a second, so please give us a quick evaluation when you get a chance. And with that, Tracy, move to that last slide and we will do Q&A. Please raise your hand and I will unmute you. But until then, I will read the questions that we have here in the chat box. I think the first couple are for Dennis. They're about budgets, but a lot of us have budget expertise too. So the acceptable 10% to move within categories, is that 10% of the total budget or 10% of the categories?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I know I probably didn't explain that as well as it should have been explained. I was trying to stay in my time limit there, but yeah, so that's 10% of the total budget when you're dealing with federal grants. So that, that's all lined out in that CFR. I'll drop that link in the chat box there so you can look at it for yourself. But it does state that, basically all of those things that I mentioned on that slide, if it doesn't involve like a change in scope of work or a new subaward or a contract or, change in personnel, those kinds of things, then you don't need prior approval to move money from one category to another category as long as it's less than 10% of your total approved budget. Now, I have seen that rule different and when you're not dealing with federal grants, but all of that is lined out in that CFR that I dropped in the chat box there. So I still think, let me reiterate though, I still think that it is, it is good practice to notify, your funder if you are moving around funds, but just be aware that you don't need a rebudget or pre-approval to do that as long as it's 10% of that total budget.
Okay, next question. Are stipends the same as participant support costs?
Yes, stipends are considered participant support cost. So are things like meals, things like that you know you would um, need to provide someone participating in, whatever project or program. Does that make sense? Did I explain it?
I think that, yes, that sounded great, she says. If equipment is written into a grant, such as a computer, does the funder take possession of said computer at the close of the grant?
That is a possibility, but I have never seen that happen. Usually they don't want that stuff back, but it is a possibility.
And I have actually seen that happen.
Okay,
So
well, there you
it
go.
depends on the funder.
Yeah.
Um, any more questions to drop in the chat box or again, raise your hand? One more announcement I should have made was that we are going to be coming to the Gulf states to do some in-person workshops on climate and resilient grant writing. So be on the lookout for some announcements about that following this workshop. Your email is mine forever now, and I will send you emails about it. Um, any more questions? I'm going to drop that evaluation link one more time. And if there's no other questions, thank you all again. Thank you to our panelists again. I appreciate your time and we will be following up. Thank you.